Now, speaking of areas where there has been less traffic than normal, we go to London. London in particular, but actually lots of different bits of the UK, have been installing LTNs, low traffic neighbourhoods, since the start of the pandemic. These are designed to cut traffic, in short, and they have been very effective in lots of ways. In some ways, they have been definitely too effective. Tim Minogue is the Eye's Rotten Boroughs correspondent, and I started off by asking him exactly what these LTNs consist of.
They are local schemes designed to reduce traffic and encourage people to walk and cycle, all very commendable. And this is achieved by chicanes, pinch points, erection of bollards and big wooden planters with shrubbery in them. And they effectively stop residential streets being used as rat runs, which is undoubtedly an issue in many cities and London in particular.
Yeah, but these planters, they look effectively like massive window boxes, but on a lot of streets, in a lot of areas in London which have these, there's no getting a car through them. So one can't help thinking this might lead to some kind of problems, because nice as low traffic is, sometimes you do need to access various roads with vehicles. Has that been a problem?
Well, in Ealing, back in the summer, the local council erected an LTN. Unfortunately, they didn't consult the emergency services, the London Ambulance Service in particular, and the LAS were very upset about this, because if an ambulance driver's coming along and he's got the address on his sat-nav or whatever, and he would expect to be able to get to it, and then he finds the road is closed off, and then he's got to go around the houses. It can have dire consequences. And in fact, we wrote about that last year, and in our roundup of the year for Rotten Boroughs, the Rotten Boroughs Awards, we mentioned it again, and we carried a cartoon showing an ambulance driver fuming because he couldn't get past the bollards. Following that, a London paramedic actually wrote to us. He said, "I saw the cartoon depicting LTNs preventing ambulance crews getting to jobs." And he says, "On a recent job, we were at the end of a street adjoining the road the cardiac arrest was on. Due to the barricade, we had to take an almost 5-minute detour around the side streets before our way to the address. 5 minutes probably doesn't seem long to whoever came up with the idea of the barriers, but to a London Ambulance Service crew trying to get to a cardiac arrest patient and give that first shock, it slashes our chances at a viable resuscitation. In this case, the patient did not survive." And he says that it's difficult to alert the management to this issue because of some problem with their software, and they're not counting these incidents. But he says with the huge spike in COVID-related cardiac arrest calls we've seen in the past few months, these barricades are literally killing patients. Private Eye is the first publication I've seen so much as mention it. It's one of those law of unintended consequences. It's one where you introduce something which is a good thing, and then it has unforeseen consequences. To be fair, I think some of the councils, because they've also had a lot of local protests in many cases, some of them are rethinking some of these schemes. And I read in the Times the other day that 1 in 10 of these schemes in London has now been withdrawn. And of course, that has its own consequence in that introducing these schemes and then taking them away cost at least £1 million.
And then there's one of the other aspects, which is relevant to the 9 in 10 of these things that still remain in London anyway, which is where this traffic that you're diverting goes. And I believe that you've been covering that a little bit as well.
Yeah, I mean this is a disputed thing, because supporters of LTNs say if you discourage traffic like this, you're just getting rid of it. They don't accept that if you say traffic is like water, it will find its way, an alternative route if one route is blocked. Supporters of LTNs dispute that and say it just discourages people from driving full stop. But again, in Lewisham last year, one of the prominent campaigners against an LTN was a lady called Rosamond Kissy-Deborah, who is a very strong anti-pollution campaigner, because it was her daughter Ella suffered from asthma, and she died aged 11. And her mum had always campaigned on the basis that Ella's asthma was exacerbated by air pollution. So she is absolutely, keen on reducing air pollution for the benefit of everyone's children. She believed that in Lewisham they had an LTN in the Lee Green area, and she believed it displaced the traffic from Hither Green, which is a more affluent part of the borough, nice leafy residential streets, and she believed it had diverted traffic to the less affluent western side, where poorer people lived, more BAME people lived, and she said on the main roads, and a lot of poorer people live nearer the main roads, asthma, respiratory complaints was worse because more traffic was concentrated there, and she used the perhaps contentious term environmental racism to describe the result of that.
So it seems fair to say that these things are, as you have already pointed out, not working exactly as intended.
No.
And that although they're laudable, reducing car traffic is laudable, it can either lead to people really not being able to get a car, or rather an ambulance, in where they need it, or that these cars are then being driven past other people who might not be able to afford to erect a low traffic neighbourhood, or might live near a main road which is then even more crowded.
Yes, that's a good summary, and I'm not a town planner or a traffic engineer, so I certainly acknowledge it's a knotty problem, but it would seem to be one of those things that councils had embraced with enormous enthusiasm without working out what the consequences might be, and I think they're only now doing the homework that perhaps they should have done earlier.